Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Samantha Tai, and I am the Audience Relations and Communication Coordinator here at InterArts Matrix. Before we continue with today's program, I would just like to take a brief moment to acknowledge that the land on which InterArts Matrix is located and the land on which I'm speaking to you is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Neutral peoples. The city, now known as Kitchener, exists under the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, which was originally signed by the Six Nations and the Dutch, but throughout history, other nations such as France and England have also signed on to this treaty. It is made up of three tenets that characterize our collective responsibility: take only what you need, leave enough for someone else, and keep the dish clean. As a settler, I acknowledge that I am bound to this treaty and that I have not always upheld my treaty duties. I also acknowledge that as the daughter of an immigrant, I have been afforded certain rights and opportunities that are not extended to people who are native to this land. Whether we are colonizers or have been colonized, it's important that we recognize the impact that colonization has had, because we are all responsible in creating a more just future for everyone. I look forward to a future where Indigenous knowledge is centered on national and international platforms. I look forward to a future where we can move forward together in partnership. Each and every one of us has a connection with the land that we are located on, and I encourage you to reflect on your relationship and what your impact has been. So welcome everyone to today's talk, our very first X Camera talk of the fall 2021 season. The X Camera series began in the spring of 2019 when a group of people who were interested in the arts began gathering at Fresh Ground Cafe or the Common Studio in downtown Kitchener. This happened every Friday until March 2020, when our gatherings shifted online due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Each week, members of the X Camera community would gather to hear a lecture by an interdisciplinary artist or professional. The lectures were followed by a question and answer period, and then time for people to stay in the cafe space, eat lunch together, continue conversations, and build a community. It's in this spirit of supporting artists and building community that X Camera continues virtually on Zoom. The series will continue in this way on Fridays at 1 p.m. for the foreseeable future. Our artist today, Arne Eigenfeldt, will begin his presentation shortly and will wrap up at about 10 to 2, at which point we will transition into our question period. We encourage you to interact with each other and the artist throughout the lecture as thoughts arise. And after the question period, we will open up the room. So if you are able to stay past 2, we would love for you to introduce yourself, to let us know what you've been up to or what you intend to work on. We'd really like this space to be open for discussions about potential future collaborations as well, so please feel free to share any ideas you have. So I will now welcome Susan Marsh-Rollo, who will introduce Arne more fully. Thank you.
Thanks, Samantha. Thank you for the introduction and our land acknowledgement. So happy Friday, and thank you all for joining us for today's edition of X Camera. I am currently a board member with InterArts Matrix, and today I have the pleasure of co-hosting along with my fellow board member, Marie-Claire LeBlanc-Flanagan. We have the utmost pleasure today to introduce you to Dr. Arne Eigenfeldt. So just to tell you a little bit about him, Dr. Eigenfeldt completed his Master of Arts at Simon Fraser and then his Doctorate of Music at Northwestern University in the States. Lucky ducky that he is, and for us as well, he was able to return to British Columbia in Canada and Simon Fraser University. So he is currently a full professor of music and technology in the School for the Contemporary Arts there. He is a composer of live electroacoustic music, which I'm looking forward to hearing more of today. And he's also a researcher into intelligent generative music systems. Now, there's so much I could tell you about him and his accomplishments, but I'm just going to give you some highlights so we can hear more from him. He's received major research grants into computational creativity and generative art. He's published over 50 peer-reviewed papers on his research and collaborations. And both his music and his research into intelligent systems have been presented on internationally. places such as the International Computer Music Conference, International Symposium for Electronic Art, New Interfaces for Musical Expression, and International Conference on Computational Creativity. After enjoying his talk today, I would also highly recommend checking out his website, which we'll post for you here today. Also his most incredible plethora of work that you can find at metacreation.net. And with that, it's my honor to hand it over to Dr. Eigenfeldt to tell us more about collaborating with intelligent machines. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that lovely introduction. I'm just going to share my screen now. Okay, so I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm privileged to be on the unceded traditional Coast Salish lands, including the Squamish, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Musqueam nations. So this talk is going to be about collaboration and my own quest to essentially collaborate with an alternate version of myself. Now, I've always identified myself as a composer, and I'll try to define what I think that means a little later. I have also coded for many years. I've created my own tools rather than primarily using commercial software. And finally, throughout my career, I have sought other musicians, performers, and artists with which to collaborate. So this talk then will describe some of that journey and the realization I had a few years ago that I actually reached a stage of collaboration with my own software. So my beginnings were in performance as a jazz bass player, and this shaped my aesthetic in two ways. I've always highly valued improvisation and interacting with other musicians and artists to create something new. All of my training was as a composer, and that has equally shaped my aesthetic. I'm fascinated or obsessed with organizing things, particularly time. And lastly, I've been coding my own software for over 30 years, and my musical aesthetic is equally shaped by this, as almost all of my work is process-based and lends itself to code. I became interested in using the computer as an artistic tool when I was a graduate student. And at that time, there was no available software to control the newly available hardware, so I learned to code on my own. This gave me the opportunity to organize things like harmony and rhythm, but also to continue working with improvising musicians who would play along with my software systems. The systems were interactive and that they reacted to my control during performance. I continued to pursue this model after I was hired at SFU, and one which I created a system that was almost like a mini orchestra at my fingertips. But instead of triggering pre-composed material, I initiated software improvisations. So here's an excerpt from a 40-minute work with the Persian Tar master, Amir Kushkani. You can see me activating and interacting with my software, triggering new ideas, altering them, and nudging the system. Okay, so the model that I described is in effect that Amir is listening to the system, and I'm listening to Amir, and I'm listening to and controlling the system. So I was thinking of my system at this time as very much as an instrument, one that could be controlled in performance. But things can get very complex in performance, much more complex than a typical musical instrument. So musicians, they spend years and years mastering their instruments, knowing exactly what to expect when they perform a certain action. But for one thing, my software was continually changing, so I don't have those years of interaction with a specific piece of software. But more importantly, I didn't want to have that direct interaction. I didn't want to have repeatable response to things. I wanted a gesture to be unpredictable at times and to see how gestures would interact. So as a result, I started thinking more and more about how how the system could actually start listening and understanding what it was doing. So about this same time, I became very interested in electronic music that was appearing online, the specific genre being ambient electronica. Now, this music is essentially tonal, which fits in the other kind of music that I'm interested in. It's concerned with timbre, but also melody and harmony, and particularly with rhythm, although the repetitive nature is a bit more, stands out a bit more than academic music. I produced a real-time system that could produce many of these, this type of music in my home studio. Now, I had to perform the system, making my usual nudges and prods, but it had to happen faster because there was no live improvising musician for the listeners to focus on. So I had to rehearse the music. And I would record my performances, listen to them, and make extensive notes, knowing which gestures I had to trigger at specific times. And at that time, between 2002 and 2005, I released 5 online albums under the pseudonym of Ramus, because I didn't want listeners to know that I was actually creating music. Music was being created by an academic. So I'll play one example. So to be clear, those melodies and rhythms and harmonies, they were not composed by me. They were all generated during the performance by the software. Now, if the system wasn't generating the features that I wanted, I had to nudge it and poke it, as I said. And as the individual algorithms became more complicated, the triggers into them also became more complex. And what you see here is one of the performance interfaces for several of the modules that I had called players. Each had their own controls. So you can see it's starting to blossom. I'm creating systems that were becoming really very, very complex to adequately control in performance. Now, complexity in the resulting art, I always think is a good thing. But the complexity in the interface and to get that oral complexity led to decreased usability. So maybe I could have spent a few years studying user interface design, but I was too busy making music and more complex systems. So nowadays, we use the term generative music to describe systems that produce music that is different with each run, in which control is given over to the system. Looking back, some aspects of these albums were generative, but they were predominantly interactive and responsive. And I began to ask myself, was I improvising on an instrument, or was I creating a system that was composing? This is a question that I posed to someone else who was doing similar work, Joel Chatterby. You see an early photograph of him there. And he said that if you do not know the result of your gesture, you can't be improvising. So Joel considered what we were doing to be interactive composing. I think that's a great term, but I also called it a real-time composition. Again, I'm not an improviser, but I'm a composer, and I was setting up compositional situations rather than improvising with them. So in a paper that I published in 2008 in eContact, the issue was on live electronics, improvisation and interactivity. I outlined what I consider to be the differences between improvisation and what I called real-time composition. The first point that I make is that I consider composition to be the deliberated ordering of events prior to the performance. And it is this deliberation, this idea to go back and edit, that allows for the horizontal and vertical complexity of Western art music. Now, improvisation offers all sorts of other types of complexities, but it can't achieve the same kind of horizontal and vertical complexities for long periods of time, simply due to the constraints on human memory and the limits of interaction between players. Like when you're improvising, you simply can't remember exactly what you did 8 minutes ago. And when your group of players cannot anticipate what's going to happen 30 seconds from now. So my goal had crystallized to achieve the organized complexity of deliberated composition, but doing this during the performance. So this is why I called it real-time composition. Now, this may seem impossible given the physical and mental limitations I just mentioned, specifically my own limitations. So while the music is occurring, I have to listen to it as it's evolving. I have to understand it and how any action that I might take may have changed things. I have to decide what needs to happen musically, and then I have to execute those changes in the software. So I felt, I couldn't do all of this myself, so I needed the software to do more, and I needed some more musical intelligence within that software. So I began to meet at that time with computer scientists about the possibility of applying aspects of artificial intelligence into my software. At the time, those scientists, they were extremely helpful and they were very enthusiastic, but they said they were actually unable to collaborate with me because they said creative research was not valued by computer science departments at the time, which is amazing when one thinks back of it, because it's highly valued nowadays. So out of the many conversations that I had had, one area of research that particularly struck me at the time that stuck out was multi-agent systems. Again, this was in the mid-2000s. This was before machine learning really took off. So agents have been defined as autonomous. They make their own decisions. They're social. They interact with one another. They're reactive. They respond to their environment. And they're proactive. They initiate their own plans. And these are all aspects of improvising musicians as well. So I was quite excited that I could sort of translate this into software. So Kinetic Engine from that period, it was my first software that used AI, specifically multi-agents. I modeled it after a conductor who might be entering a room, and there would be 6 percussionists in there and a whole bunch of percussion instruments on the floor. Each agent could pick up an instrument and have a general idea and understanding of the role that instrument played in the ensemble. For example, instruments like shakers and cymbals, they could be made to play quickly and in syncopation, while larger bass drums played less frequently and on the beat. As such, each agent had to have some musical knowledge. The conductor would then set a tempo and give an indication of how much desire or density or activity was desired. The next problem was how does the music, let me just stop that. The next problem was how is the music supposed to start? Which agent would play first? So I anthropomorphized my agents and I gave them personalities. So confidence, those agents with higher confidence would begin to play first. Responsiveness, those with higher responsiveness would react to a conductor's changes more quickly. Those with higher social desires would interact with more agents. And so the agents would all be listening to one another, making decisions on their own based upon the conditions of the environment. They'd react to one another and make those decisions completely on their own. So you can see I've turned on the system and now they start listening. There's a bit of chaos because they don't know exactly what they're doing, but they're communicating and they're starting to negotiate and come up with patterns. You could also see here in the corner that the conductor is messaging back whether or not they're reaching the goal that that the conductor is setting. So I continued to create systems that imbued artificial agents with musical intelligence. By 2011, I began to collaborate with Ajay Kapoor, who is the designer of robotic instruments. So instead of having my agents play recorded sounds like the previous example, they would actually play acoustic instruments. And I also began to have my system start to listen to the performer. So here's an example with Daniel Tones, who's a percussionist. The system is listening to what he's doing. It's also presenting the information that it's generating to him, so he could actually see what's happening. So you can see he's looking at a monitor that's showing him what the agents are currently, what harmony they're currently in. So I created some of these systems that had a basic ability to listen to what the performer was doing, but there was a huge difficulty in getting the system to really understand what the performer was doing. So listening and understanding is much different. So this problem became the basis of this next work. In the Indifference Engine, one agent is assigned to listening to the performer. Now that agent has been trained to learn something about the sounds that the performer is using, and it can identify the sounds that are being played. And the performance agents have a huge database of sounds that they can access based upon that knowledge. The agents have beliefs about what the performer is doing. They have desires, and that they have individual goals and how to execute the performance, and they create intentions and how to move towards those goals. However, each of the 8 agents only gets access to the performer's information for a short period of time. Every 2 seconds, they get half a second each just to figure out what's going on. Now, of course, things change very, very quickly. And so as a result, each agent has a differing belief of what is happening. As a result, the agents often spend more time arguing and disagreeing with one another. And the result is a seeming indifference to the live performer. And that's the title. Hopefully you can hear that the agents are proactive and that they're making music, and they're not waiting for Brian to begin. They just go off and play. They're happy to make music. When he does play, they react to him, but the reaction isn't exactly predictable. So by 2013, my systems have become quite autonomous. As you saw me, I'm just sitting there staring at my screen the whole time. In other words, I wasn't interacting very much with the system. And so they've really become truly generative at this point. However, I was still interested in the possibility of real-time composition in which I could interact with my system at a very high level. So that possibility arose with a commission from Vancouver's Turning Point Ensemble. So I had proposed that my system would generate live notated music, which would be displayed for the 8 musicians on iPads. The work would be in 3 movements, and each movement used a different corpus of music from which it had learned certain musical features. So this is a brief explanation of the system now. So the real-time composition would have involved me deciding which motives were interesting and should continue to be developed in the genetic pool, as well as possible transformations. But while I was rehearsing the system on my own, I realized that this would again be placing too much cognitive load on me, as I'd be required to listen, understand, react, and control. As a result, I created a series of scripts that did all of this for me. And in performance, I simply watched the system unfold. So much for real-time composition. So one important collaboration that began for me about 10 years ago was with a computer scientist, Philippe Pasquier, and technologist, Ollie Baun. We shared a musical interest in research interest in musical metacreation. So metacreation is the contemporary evolution of generative art, and musical metacreation, or MUMI, is the design and use of computer music systems which are creative on their own. Metacreation is the confluence of a variety of disciplines, but most important from my perspective are the inclusion of artists. So my contribution to musical metacreation would be the development of Musebots. So Musebots are a logical progression from my earlier work with multi-agent systems. Musebots are pieces of software that autonomously create music collaboratively with other Musebots. So Musebots offer a structure for the design of musical agents. Musebots allowed me to delve even deeper into creating virtual agents, including the modeling of Musebots on specific musicians. So the Musebot protocol, which was published in 2015, is at its heart simply a method of communicating states and intentions. Individual Musebots would send network messages via OSC, and a conductor served as a running time generating kind of as a hub for all the messages to pass. So I've been able to apply Musebots in my research into generating large-scale structure. This remains an open problem in the MUMI community, as demonstrated by the continued reliance on humans to remain within the creative loop, whether it's using a live performer or a software operator to move things forward. Generating entire musical compositions entails the development of musical form. That's a highly complex task. So form involves the complex interaction of multiple musical structures in order to coherently organize the work's progression in time. So here you have a sort of graphic analysis of a piece of music by Bach. Knowing, for example, when to alter or stop a gesture or a section is a very difficult notion. It's dependent a great deal on the existing musical context. So in 2016, I began to use Musebots within a systematic exploration of moment form. Rather than employing bottom-up self-organization improvisational model that I've been previously using, Moments uses a combination of top-down and bottom-up methodologies. So one Musebot generates a structure for each composition, and it consists of individual sections within which the audio Musebots negotiate the musical details, given the goals provided by a structure bot. So in this collaboration with Vancouver cellist Peggy Lee, the Musebots are working with this pre-generated moment form structure. That structure and the generated pitch sets are presented to Peggy. You can see her always looking at the monitor. The Musebots perform, they listen to one another, but they're also listening to Peggy. In fact, they don't discriminate between Peggy, and they assume she is simply another Musebot. So this next work, also one of the moments pieces, was a collaboration with Simon Overstall, who's a Vancouver-based audio and video artist. And Simon made some visual Musebots that similarly operated within the generated moment form structure. Movement artists Rob Kitsos and Yves Candu, they improvised to the visual and audio environment. We gave 6 different performances of the work, and each one was unique. We're just going to see one of the moments in this example. So in this example, the Musebots are going to be interacting with the guitarist Matthew Ariaratnam. One is doing live audio analysis and sending that information to the other Musebots, and then 2 audio Musebots are reacting to those messages. And there's also another Musebot that's providing effects over everything. And again, I'm not adding any of that. It's making these sort of intelligent effects, saying, well, this would be a good point to add more reverb or add a bit of distortion. Now, each audio Musebot has a very large corpus, over 1 gigabyte of material, including recordings of Matthew improvising. And the Musebots were trained on his playing. Now, so when he played something, they could have responded with the same material back, what they had in their database. But again, I'm not interested in that kind of one-to-one relationship. So I made a situation where they were forced to look for other places in their database for similar kind of material. So a few years ago, my friend in Australia, Ollie Bound, he suggested to me that Musebots might be able to generate trap music. And I said, what's trap music? So then I took a deep dive, did extensive listening, and I coded some Musebots to reproduce some of the individual parts of trap music. And they could endlessly generate tunes. And 6 weeks after he told me this, or he asked me to do this, they released an album on Spotify. So here's an example of one of those songs. Oops. Yeah, so you can find that music on Spotify searching for Mr. Musebot. And Spotify always informs me every month how many listeners I have. You've had 3 listeners this month. So I think, yay, it was all worth it. So recent collaborations include working with theater and dance artist Catherine Ricketts and continuing to work with Simon Overstall. And we created an evening-long performance based on the texts of Samuel Beckett. This excerpt uses moment form, which I described earlier, with the Musebot generating a structure that informs text bots and lighting bots and 2 robotic instruments. So Catherine will be improvising her movement, knowing that there'll be displayed running text that changes location. In the fall of 2020, during the middle of the worldwide pandemic, Catherine sent me 10 videos that she did of her character Lug. So these videos, and here's an example of one of the videos. These videos were shot in around her home in Regina and involved the character interacting with the environment with a long coat, a suitcase, and the contents of the suitcase. So I approached this new collaboration as another potential collaboration between myself and my Musebots. What could they offer in this artwork? And what could they do with 10 videos? So I created a generative framework for them to operate within. And once again, I collaborated with Simon Overstall to work on the visual Musebots. And we made this a new generative work. So the result are a series of videos, because there's continually running videos that last anywhere from 5 to 15 minutes, in which the Musebots negotiate a database of audio and video recordings. So I had the 10 videos from Catherine, and I also asked some musicians worldwide, actually, Joshua Hyde, who's in Graz on saxophone, Alice Purton in London on cello, Felix Del Tredici in Montreal on trombone, and Daniel Brew in the UK. And I asked them to contribute improvisations on their part, recorded improvisations for about 1 minute in length, several of them that reflected what they were thinking at that time, being in a worldwide shutdown. So the work actually continues my earlier generative artworks, in which the process of convergence by agents is the focus. When we start from kind of random individualism, they somehow come together. That's the name of the title, Coming Together. The general idea is that the agents initially choose an audio and a video recording, and they play filtered portions of it. Within the audio, it's spectral filtering, and within the video, you'll see some color filtering. As the negotiation progresses, the agents attempt to agree on a single video and an audio recording, and the combined filtered segments could make a singular whole. So before concluding, I'd like to return to the notion of collaboration. Hopefully I've shown that collaborating with other artists has always been central to my practice, but I'd also like now to suggest that my Musebots have reached a point where I feel that I'm collaborating with them. And this is different than using them as a tool or as a creative assistant. Now, looking back in history, the possibility of having a virtual creative assistant has intrigued artists since the mid-19th century, when Ada Lovelace speculated upon the musical potential of Babbage's analytical engine. In the last 50 years, there have been many instances of computers being used as creative assistants, helping to fulfill the vision of a single artist. However, I argue that while a creative assistant is certainly useful, such a role is always secondary to the principal artist. Collaboration suggests a flat hierarchy in which all members have an equal voice in the final creation. So generative systems such as mine are created through an iterative design process, continual testing of the system that results in fine-tuning of its code or its parameters, what Ollie Baum describes as finding the sweet spot. One can argue that coding such a system is an act of collaboration, since the continual refinement of the code is based upon listening to its output. However, this type of collaboration is really only in one direction, right? While the design and test methodology may result in alterations to the code because of this listening, the resulting interaction is no more collaborative than a playwright making changes to a script after a read-through. So I've found my own relationship with the Musebots is different than with any other generative system that I've created. Because they lack interactivity, I'm unable to affect surface changes, and instead must alter the Musebots' personality at a much deeper level. Like human improvisers, Musebots are independent and autonomous. I can suggest and possibly provoke, but unlike chamber musicians reading fixed scores, I cannot force them to perform specific actions. The Musebots operate in a complex system. Like any such system, it's difficult to understand the complex interactions that occur while it's operating, even as its designer. As social entities, the Musebots react to one another, and as reactive agents, they respond to their environment. So in one performance, a structure was generated that required long and extremely quiet sections, which the Musebots then interpreted by playing almost inaudibly. So I had a performance in Australia where you could be playing robotic instruments and you could see them move, but you couldn't hear anything. So rather than eliminating the possibility of long, quiet sections, I opted to allow the non-compliant Musebots to override such requests, but again, not all the time. So instead of adding a rule, I created a further possibility. I was forced to confront my own desire to avoid such uneventful music with a desire for the Musebots to continue to produce surprising music. So in recent months, there's been a great deal of media interest in the notion of art created by artificial intelligence, with a somewhat predictable reaction and fear that artists are being replaced by software. This is reminiscent of any occasion in which new technology has been introduced within society, followed by a propagated fear that the current status quo would be disrupted in a negative way. Artificial intelligence will no doubt change the way artists create, if it hasn't done so already. Many artists in the past decades have already attempted to create a symbiotic relationship with technology, to interact with it in such a way that it assists them in their creative process. Making tools more powerful by coding autonomous systems that might produce creative ideas on their own will require alternative working methods, but ones that I would suggest are already being used in human creative practice. Instead of placing the software in a secondary and limited role of assistant, the software can become a viable partner and collaborator, offering independent ideas that extend, provoke, and elevate the individual creative process. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. Can you hear me clearly? Give me a nod.
Yep.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah. Yeah, it was fascinating, and I loved the way you led us in from the beginning, talking about collaboration and then leading us back to collaboration at the end. Personally, I just found it really yeah, fascinating. So what's going to happen next for everyone who's here is we're going to move into a question period. and we welcome any questions at all. They're all welcome. And I have some questions myself. And if you like, you can write the questions in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and say your question aloud. Both are equally welcome. And what I'd like to do actually is give a moment to people. Like, actually, I know this is very strange, but I'd like to give a moment of like 10 to 20 seconds of silence just for people to process and have a moment to like let that run over them. So Arne, if you want to like have a sip of your water, feel free. I'm just gonna watch my clock and give people a few seconds to process the information that just came. I think in future, I would love to put a visual in this time on the screen, so you have some beautiful meditative thing to process. But I have a number of questions, so I'm going to leap into them unless questions pop up in the chat. Let me just take a look and see if people have burning questions. Okay.
Look like it?
Looks like not yet. Okay, I'm gonna ask a question, and I want people to treat this a little bit informally. We're a small group of people who all really like each other and excited about things, so like feel free to jump in. Yeah, this is not a formal situation where there's like a protocol. It's not like that. So Arne, my first question, I was fascinated by this thing when you were talking about improvisation and versus composition. I loved this quote from someone named Joel. Where you said you were quoting Joel and saying, "If you don't know the results of your gesture, you can't be improvising." I feel like I could have a million questions about that, but that is not the first thing I want to ask. The first thing I want to ask is, in your opinion, like based on your ideas around this, would you say something like 433 is a composition or is not?
433 by Cage is definitely a composition because it's a structure that he's created, right? And the things that happen may be unknowable and unpredictable as to what's going to occur in that structure, but just by saying 4 minutes and 33 seconds, you know, that is a composed idea. That's a block, a structure of time that he's created. So definitely a structure. And just to talk a little bit more about that idea of improvisation, it's in no way belittling what improvisers do. You know, when I say that they don't know what they're doing. See, I would argue, again, not being an improviser, but my discussions with improvisers is that, you know, what do they actually practice? You know, once they've mastered their instrument, how do you practice improvisation? It's achieving that level of, when I do this, this may happen. They may not know where it's going to go musically, but they do know the results of their actions. When they play these certain keys, this is going to happen. So there's an unknowability. You know, I'm not suggesting that they know exactly what's going to happen, but they know what, you know, when they press a key, something is going to happen, and they have that. They know exactly, you know, how hard they press, it's going to have this kind of a sound. And that's the kind of relationship with my systems, is that when I press something, start something off, I may have no idea what's going to happen. I have a loose idea, but it can just go off. So I'm setting these processes up that, like, one process is supposed to interact with another process, go at it to see what happens, right? And so that's the idea of the unknowability from a compositional point of view. I've set up a structure just like Cage did. I've set that structure up to allow things to happen, but I'm controlling the structure, but I'm not able to control what's happening within it. I hope that makes sense.